The spaceport was full of people and noise and the smell of fuel and food from many different worlds, and Commander Jake Morrison walked through the crowd like he owned the place, because in his mind he kind of did since he had been flying ships for the Terran Defense Fleet, longer than most of these civilians had been alive, and right now he was late for a meeting that could change everything about the war against the Krell, and he did not have time to deal with people who moved too slowly or blocked his path, and his flight suit had more medals and patches than anyone else in this terminal. And people should have been getting out of his way, but they were not. And that made him angry in a way that had been building for weeks now, since the battles had gotten worse and the brass kept demanding more missions with less rest and fewer resources, and nobody seemed to appreciate what pilots like him were sacrificing every single day to keep these colonies safe from the alien threat that wanted to wipe humanity from the stars. Jake pushed past a family looking at a holographic map showing the different levels of the station, and their kid bumped into his leg, and the father gave him a dirty look like Jake was the problem, and not the fact that they were standing in the middle of the busiest corridor during rush hour, and Jake muttered something under his breath about civilians and kept moving, because Fleet Command did not accept excuses for being late, and Admiral Harris was not the kind of man who forgave tardiness, especially when they were planning the biggest operation of the war, and Jake's role in it was crucial since he knew the Krell patrol patterns better than anyone, and had survived more encounters with their ships than any other pilot in the fleet, and his tactical knowledge was worth more than all the computer simulations in the universe. And yet here he was, stuck behind tourists and merchants and people who had no idea that their peaceful lives existed only because men and women like him were willing to fly into hell and back every single day. Then someone hit his shoulder hard enough to make him stumble, and his tablet nearly fell from his hand. And Jake spun around ready to yell at whoever had just crashed into him, and found himself looking at a tall black woman in plain civilian clothes, holding a coffee cup that was now spilling down her arm and onto her sleeve, and her face showed she was not happy about it, and Jake's first thought was that she should have been watching where she was going instead of walking around with hot coffee in a crowded spaceport, and his second thought was that he did not have time for this, and his third thought never got a chance to form because his mouth was already moving, and the words came out sharp and angry, like they had been waiting for an excuse to escape. "Watch where you are going," he said, and his voice carried the tone of someone who expected immediate obedience, and the woman looked up at him, and her eyes were dark and intelligent, and definitely not intimidated by his uniform or his rank or anything else about him, and she said, "Excuse me, but you walked into me, Commander." And her voice had that careful control that meant she was trying very hard not to lose her temper, and Jake felt his own control slipping because how dare this civilian tell him what happened when he knew exactly what happened, and it was her fault, not his. And he did not have time to stand here and argue with someone who probably had never faced any real danger in her entire comfortable life. "I do not have time for this," Jake said, and turned to leave because arguing with civilians was beneath him, and he had important things to do and places to be and a war to win. But the woman stepped in front of him and blocked his path and said, "Actually, Commander, you do have time to apologize when you bump into someone and cause them to spill their coffee." And something about the way she said it, like she had authority and was used to being listened to, made Jake even angrier because this was new, Harmony Station. And it was under military jurisdiction during wartime, and that meant fleet personnel had priority over everything and everyone. And this woman was acting like she had some kind of right to delay him and lecture him about manners, when people were dying out there in the black, and he was one of the few things standing between humanity and extinction. The stress of the past 3 weeks hit him all at once, and the sleepless nights after that mission, where he lost 2 wingmen to a Krell ambush, and the way Command kept sending them back out with barely enough time to refuel and rearm, and the nightmares about the transport ship he could not save, and the faces of the people he watched die through his cockpit screen, and the constant pressure and the fear he never admitted to anyone, and the bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of sleep could fix, and the knowledge that tomorrow he would have to do it all again, and the day after that, and the day after that, until eventually his luck ran out, or his reflexes slowed just a fraction too much, and he joined the long list of pilots who never came home, and all of that weight and anger and fear came together in one terrible moment of complete loss of control. His hand moved before his brain could stop it, and the slap echoed through the terminal like a gunshot, and everything went silent, and the woman's head snapped to the side, and Jake's hand stung, and his heart was pounding, and around them hundreds of people stopped and stared and pulled out their personal devices to record what was happening. And the woman slowly turned her head back to face him and touched her cheek where his hand had left a red mark, and her expression changed from surprise to something cold and dangerous and controlled, and Jake suddenly realized what he had done and felt his stomach drop because there was no taking it back and no excuse that would make it right. And he had just assaulted a civilian in front of hundreds of witnesses, and his career was probably over, and he deserved whatever happened next. "Do you know who I am?" the woman asked, and her voice was quiet. But somehow everyone in the terminal could hear it. And Jake shook his head because he had no idea. And right now he did not care, because nothing she could say would make this situation any better or any worse than it already was, and he just wanted to disappear or wake up and find out this was all a nightmare. But the woman was reaching into her jacket, and several security officers who had been moving through the crowd were suddenly running toward them, and Jake thought maybe she was going for a weapon. And part of him almost hoped she was, because at least then he could claim self-defense. But what she pulled out was worse than any weapon, because it was a badge, and not just any badge, but the kind with a holographic seal that marked her as senior law enforcement, and she held it up so the light caught it, and everyone could see it clearly. "I am Chief of Police Victoria Grant," the woman said, "and you, Commander, are under arrest for assault." And Jake felt the blood drain from his face because he knew that name. And everyone who worked in law enforcement or military security knew that name, because Victoria Grant was a legend, and she had cleaned up corruption on 3 different colonies and personally led raids against pirate bases, and once arrested a colonial governor who thought he was above the law, and she reported directly to the Colonial Council and had the authority to investigate anyone, including fleet officers. And Jake had just hit her in front of hundreds of witnesses, and there was no way out of this, and no one who could save him now. The security officers formed a circle around them, and Jake noticed they were not fleet security but station police, and they were Chief Grant's people, and they looked at him with disgust and anger, and one of them looked like he wanted to hit Jake back, and maybe would have if his boss had not been standing right there. And Jake tried to say something to explain or apologize, but Chief Grant held up one hand and said, "Save it." And then she looked at one of the officers and said, "Parker read the commander his rights and take him into custody, and I want him processed within the hour." And Officer Parker was a big man who looked like he had been waiting his whole career for a chance to arrest someone like Jake, and he stepped forward, with handcuffs already in his hands. Jake felt the cold metal close around his wrists and heard Parker reading him his rights in a voice that showed he was enjoying every word, and around them people were recording everything on their phones and tablets, and by the time they reached the police station, the whole thing would be on the Colonial Net, and everyone would see Commander Jake Morrison, decorated war hero and respected pilot, being arrested like a common criminal, and his career was definitely over now, and probably his life as he knew it, and all because he could not control his temper for 5 seconds. And as Parker led him away, Jake looked back at Chief Grant and saw she was accepting a towel from another officer and wiping the coffee from her sleeve, and her face showed nothing but professional calm. But her eyes showed something else, and it was not anger or hatred but disappointment. And somehow that was worse than anything else, because it meant she had expected better from him, and he had failed to meet even the most basic standards of human decency. The police station processing center was bright and cold, and smelled like cleaning chemicals and fear. And Jake sat in a hard plastic chair while they took his fingerprints and scanned his retinas and photographed him from every angle, like he was a dangerous criminal instead of someone who had served his planet for 20 years and saved thousands of lives and won medals for valor. And all of that meant nothing now, because he had lost control for just a moment and hit someone who turned out to be one of the most powerful law enforcement officers in the colonies, and there was no coming back from that, and no amount of past service would erase what those cameras had recorded and what millions of people would see before the day was over. Officer Parker processed him with obvious satisfaction and made sure every step took as long as possible, and asked questions he already knew the answers to, just to make Jake say them out loud and on the record. And by the time they put him in a holding cell, Jake felt completely numb and hollow, like everything inside him had been scooped out and replaced with shame and regret, and the certain knowledge that his life as he knew it was over, and he had done it to himself and had no one else to blame. And that was somehow the worst part, because he could not even pretend he was a victim of circumstances or bad luck or anything, except his own stupid anger and lack of control. The holding cell was small with gray walls and a metal bench and a toilet in the corner with no privacy, and a camera in the ceiling watching everything. And Jake sat on the bench and put his head in his hands and tried to understand how everything had gone so wrong so fast, and just this morning he had been a respected commander with an important meeting ahead of him. And now he was sitting in a cell waiting to find out how many years of his life he would spend in prison and whether the fleet would stand by him or abandon him, and whether his name would become a cautionary tale about pilots who crack under pressure and lose everything they worked for in a single moment of rage. 20 years of service, and it all came down to this, and Jake thought about all the missions he had flown, and all the times he had put his life on the line, and all the friends he had lost, and the scars he carried both visible and invisible, and none of it mattered anymore because one mistake had erased everything good he had ever done, and defined him as someone who hits women and loses control. And he wondered if his parents would ever speak to him again, and if his old squadron would defend him or quietly distance themselves, and if there was any chance at all that he could somehow survive this with any shred of dignity intact. The door at the end of the cell block opened, and Jake looked up, expecting his lawyer, or maybe Admiral Harris, coming to yell at him, or officially tell him he was being dishonorably discharged. But instead, Chief Victoria Grant walked in alone, and her footsteps echoed in the quiet corridor, and she stopped outside his cell and looked at him with an expression he could not read, and the mark on her cheek had faded from bright red to a light pink. But it was still visible, and Jake felt a fresh wave of shame wash over him because he had done that, and no amount of apologizing would ever undo it or make it right. Why, she asked, and it was just one word, but it contained so many questions, and Jake wanted to explain about the stress and the pressure, and the nightmares and the constant fear and the way everything had been building up inside him for weeks, but when he opened his mouth, none of those excuses seemed good enough, and he realized that nothing he could say would justify what he had done, because there was no justification for hitting another person, especially someone who had simply asked him to apologize for bumping into her and spilling her coffee, and he closed his mouth and sat there in silence trying to find words that did not exist. "There is no why," he said finally, and his voice sounded rough and tired, and he cleared his throat and continued, "There is no excuse, and I was angry and I took it out on you, and I am sorry." And he knew. Sorry was not enough, and would never be enough, but it was all he had, and Chief Grant nodded slowly like she had expected that answer and asked, "Do you know what I was doing at the spaceport this morning, Commander?" And Jake shook his head because he had no idea, and honestly did not care very much because whatever she had been doing, he had ruined it along with everything else. "I was meeting with Fleet Admiral Chen to discuss a joint operation," Chief Grant said, and her voice was calm and professional, like she was giving a briefing and not talking to the man who had just assaulted her, and she continued, "We have been tracking a smuggling ring that has been stealing military equipment and selling it to the Krell. And we needed a pilot for a covert mission, and someone with experience in deep space navigation and combat situations, and someone who knows the Krell better than almost anyone in the fleet. And your name came up, Commander, and Admiral Chen spoke very highly of your skills and your record, and we were going to offer you the mission. And it would have been dangerous but important, and could have changed the course of the war." The word was hit Jake like a physical punch, and he repeated it quietly and Chief Grant nodded and said yes. Was because obviously I cannot work with someone who assaults people when they get frustrated. And I have spent the last 3 hours dealing with the fallout from your little display, and the colonial governor is furious and wants you prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, and the media is running the story on every channel and calling for your head, and the fleet is trying to decide whether to support you or cut you loose, and Admiral Harris is so angry I thought he was going to have a heart attack, and all of this is happening while we have a limited window to stop these smugglers before they move that stolen equipment and potentially kill thousands of people." Jake felt sick, and not just because he had destroyed his own career, but because his moment of stupidity might cost lives. And the mission Chief Grant was describing sounded exactly like the kind of thing he was good at, and the kind of thing that could make a real difference in the war. And he had thrown it all away because he could not control himself for 5 seconds, and he looked up at Chief Grant and asked, "What do you think they should do?" And she looked surprised by the question, like she had expected him to make excuses or beg for mercy, and she studied his face for a long moment before answering. "What I think does not matter as much as what you think," Chief Grant said, and her eyes were sharp and intelligent and seemed to see right through him, and she asked, "What do you think should happen to you?" Commander, and Jake thought about it and realized There was only one answer he could give if he wanted to live with himself, and he stood up from the bench and walked to the bars and looked her in the eye and said they should discipline me according to the law and no special treatment because of my rank or my service record, and I assaulted you, and that is a crime whether I am wearing this uniform or not. And I need to face the consequences like anyone else would. Chief Grant looked at him for a long time, and her expression did not change, but something shifted in her eyes. And she asked, "Do you mean that?" And Jake nodded and said yes. "And I spent 20 years defending the law and protecting people. And I do not get to be exempt from it just because I had a bad day or because I am tired or stressed or whatever other excuse I might want to use. And if I am not willing to be held accountable, then everything I did for the past 20 years was a lie, and I would rather go to prison knowing I stood by my principles than walk free knowing I am a hypocrite." Chief Grant pulled up a holographic display from her wrist device, and the blue light made her face look strange, and she scrolled through what looked like files and reports and said, "Your service record is impressive, Commander, and very impressive. Actually, and 3 tours in hostile territory, and you pulled your entire squadron out of an ambush at the Battle of Proxima Station. And according to this, you have saved approximately 4,000 lives over your career and received 2 commendations for valor and a medal for extraordinary heroism. And your tactical assessments have been used to train new pilots, and your knowledge of Krell battle tactics is considered the best in the fleet, and every commanding officer you ever served under had nothing but praise for your skills and your dedication. That does not excuse what I did," Jake said quietly, and Chief Grant nodded and said, "No, it does not," and closed the holographic display, and the cell block went back to normal lighting, and she looked at him and said, "But it does complicate things, Commander, because you see I have a problem, and that smuggling ring I mentioned is not just stealing random equipment, and they are stealing very specific things, and we intercepted a transmission 3 days ago that suggests they have acquired a Krell stealth frigate, and if they get it operational and figure out how to fly it, they could slip past every defense system in human space and hit targets we thought were completely safe, and hundreds or thousands of people could die." Jake felt his blood go cold because he knew what a Krell stealth frigate could do, and he had seen the aftermath of attacks by those ships, and they were faster and more heavily armed than anything humanity had, and their stealth technology made them almost impossible to detect until they were already firing, and in the wrong hands that kind of ship would be a massacre waiting to happen. And he looked at Chief Grant and saw she understood exactly how bad this was and how urgent the situation had become. And he asked, "How long do we have?" And she said, "We think they are planning to move the ship within 72 hours, and after that, we lose our chance to stop them. So here is what I am offering," Chief Grant said, and her voice was steady and businesslike, like she was negotiating a contract, "and work with me on this operation and help me stop these smugglers before they can use that ship. And if you do that, I will recommend a plea agreement to the prosecutor and probation, instead of jail time and community service and mandatory anger management counseling. And you will keep your rank, though you will face a formal reprimand, and it will be on your record forever, and your career will never be what it could have been, but you will still have a career. And more importantly, you will save lives and do something good, instead of just sitting in a cell feeling sorry for yourself." "And if I refuse?" Jake asked, and Chief Grant said, "Then you face the full consequences of your actions and assault charges, and probably a dishonorable discharge and jail time, and your life as you know it is over. And I still need to find someone to stop those smugglers, and it will take time I do not have. And people might die while I am looking for a replacement, and their blood will be on both our hands and yours, because you had a chance to help and chose not to, and mine because I let pride or anger or whatever get in the way of doing what needs to be done. And I am not willing to let that happen, Commander, so I am asking you to make a choice." Jake looked at her and tried to understand why she was offering him this chance, and he asked, "Why are you doing this?" "And I hit you in front of hundreds of people, and you could destroy my career and be completely justified, and no one would blame. You and probably most people would expect you to throw the book at me and make an example out of me, and show that no one is above the law, not even decorated war heroes. And so why are you offering me a way out?" And Chief Grant tilted her head slightly and looked at him like she was trying to decide how honest to be, and then she said, "Because I am not interested in destruction, Commander, and I am interested in justice, and justice is not always about punishment." She continued and said, "Sometimes justice is about redemption and giving people a chance to be better than their worst moment. And I have read your file and talked to people who served with you, and everyone says the same thing, and that you are one of the best pilots they have ever seen, and that you care about your people and that you have saved lives again and again and put yourself in danger to protect others. And that does not sound like someone who goes around hitting people, and it sounds like someone who made a terrible mistake and is capable of learning from it and doing better. And I believe in second chances, Commander, but make no mistake. This is your only one, and you work with me and you follow my rules and you prove that today was an aberration and not the real you. And if you step out of line even once the deal is off and you face everything I just described and more. Understood, Chief Jake said, and his voice was rough with emotion because no one had shown him this kind of grace in a long time. And he did not deserve it, but he was grateful for it anyway. And he would spend the rest of his life proving she made the right choice. And Chief Grant tapped on her wrist device and the cell door slid open with a soft hiss. And she said, "Then let us get to work, Commander, because we are running out of time and those smugglers are not going to stop themselves." And Jake stepped out of the cell feeling like a weight had been partially lifted from his shoulders. And he knew he would carry the shame of what he had done for the rest of his life. But at least now he had a chance to do something good. And maybe save some lives and prove he was more than just his worst moment. Chief Grant led him through the police station and past officers who stared at him with various expressions, ranging from curiosity to disgust. And Jake kept his head up and his shoulders back, because whatever happened next, he was going to face it with dignity. And they went down a corridor and through a security door and into a briefing room that had a large holographic display in the center, showing a star map with several locations marked in red. And two people were already waiting in the room, and one was a thin man with sharp eyes who looked like he missed nothing. And the other was a young woman with the kind of focused expression that came from spending more time with computers than people. Commander Morrison, meet Detective Lucas Stone and Technical Specialist Karen Webb, Chief Grant said, and they will be your team for this operation. And Detective Stone looked at Jake with obvious skepticism and said, "This is the guy who slapped you, Chief, and are you sure about this?" And Chief Grant said, "I am sure. And Commander Morrison made a mistake, but he is also the best pilot in the fleet and we need him." And Stone did not look convinced, but he nodded and said, "Yes." Chief and Karen Webb just looked at Jake with curiosity, like he was an interesting puzzle she wanted to solve. And she asked, "Can you fly a modified cargo hauler with outdated navigation systems through an asteroid field while being chased by pirates?" "Done it before," Jake said, "and twice, actually." And Karen smiled slightly and said, "Good, because that is exactly what we need." And she brought up the holographic display and zoomed in on a sector of space near the colonial frontier and said, "The smugglers are operating out of here. And this is called the Vega Drift, and it is an uncharted asteroid cluster that plays hell with sensors and navigation. And it is the perfect place to hide if you do not want to be found. And we have been trying to get solid intelligence on their base for weeks, but every time we send a probe, it gets destroyed or disappears. And we need someone to actually fly in there and look around and find out where they are keeping that frigate." Chief Grant stepped forward and said, "Our intelligence suggests they are planning to move the Krell frigate within the next 72 hours. And if we can intercept them during the transfer, we can shut down the entire operation and recover the ship and capture everyone involved, but it has to be covert. And if they know we are coming, they will scatter and we will lose our chance and probably never find them again. And the next time we hear about them will be when that frigate starts attacking civilian targets and people start dying, and so we have one shot to get this right. And I am trusting you, Commander, to help us make that happen." And Jake looked at the star map and felt something inside him shift. And this was what he was good at, and this was what he had trained for. And this was his chance to prove Chief Grant right about him and to show everyone, including himself, that he was more than just his anger and his mistakes. The next 48 hours were a blur of planning and preparation, and Jake barely slept as he studied star charts and sensor readings and intelligence reports about the smuggling ring and their operations. And Karen Webb turned out to be brilliant with technology and could hack into systems Jake did not even know existed. And Detective Stone knew everything about criminal networks and how smugglers thought and operated. And Chief Grant coordinated everything with a level of efficiency that made Jake understand why she had such a legendary reputation. And together they built a plan that was dangerous and complicated, but just might work if they got lucky, and no one made any mistakes. The ship they would be using was called the Dancing Bear, and it was an old cargo hauler that looked like it should have been scrapped 20 years ago, and the hull was covered in dents and patches, and the paint had faded so much you could barely read the name, but Karen had upgraded the engines and the shield systems and installed surveillance equipment that was hidden so well even Jake could not find it all, and she explained that the key to infiltrating the Vega Drift was to look like they belonged there. And smugglers expected cargo haulers to be old and beat up because that was what legitimate freight companies used when they were trying to save money. Jake spent hours in the pilot seat getting familiar with the dancing bear and learning her quirks, and every ship had quirks and ways they wanted to be flown, and this one pulled slightly to the left when you engaged the main thrusters, and the artificial gravity had a delay when you changed course too quickly, and the navigation system was 3 generations old and took forever to calculate jump coordinates. But the engines had power when you needed it, and the ship was more maneuverable. Then she looked, and Jake started to develop a grudging respect for the old hauler, and he thought she might just get them through this if he flew her right and treated her with the care she deserved. Chief Grant insisted on coming on the mission despite Jake and Stone both arguing that she should stay behind and coordinate from the station, and she said flatly that she did not become chief of police by sitting behind a desk and letting other people take all the risks, and besides, she wanted to see these famous flying skills everyone kept telling her about. And Jake realized she was testing him and seeing if he would try to protect her or treat her like she could not handle herself. And he nodded and said, "Understood, Chief," and did not argue anymore because he was learning that Victoria Grant was someone who earned respect through action, not rank. And she was coming on this mission, whether he liked it or not. They launched from New Harmony Station at 0400 hours, and the space around the station was full of traffic and commercial ships and military patrols, and no one paid any attention to one more cargo hauler heading out toward the frontier, and that was exactly what they wanted. And Jake kept the dancing bear at a casual pace and followed standard traffic patterns and acted like they were just another freight crew trying to make a living. And after 2 hours they were clear of the main shipping lanes and could increase speed without attracting attention, and the stars streaked past as they headed toward the Vega Drift, and whatever waited for them there. Chief Grant sat in the co-pilot seat and watched Jake work, and she did not talk much. But Jake could feel her observing everything he did, and every decision he made. And at first it made him nervous. But then he realized she was not judging him or waiting for him to make a mistake, and she was learning and trying to understand how he thought and how he flew. And after a while he relaxed and started explaining things as he did them, and pointing out details in the sensor readings, and she asked good questions and listened carefully to his answers, and Jake found himself enjoying the conversation more than he expected. "You do not have to come on this mission," Chief Jake said as they approached the edge of the Vega Drift and Stone, "and Karen could handle the ground portion while I fly, and you have already done more than enough by giving me this chance." And Chief Grant looked at him with a slight smile and said, "Commander, I did not give you a chance so you could protect me from danger, and I gave you a chance so you could do your job, and I am doing mine. And my job is to catch criminals and recover stolen military equipment, and that means going into the drift and seeing this through, and besides, if something goes wrong out here, I want to be there to see it, and not sitting safe on the station wondering what happened." Jake nodded and felt something shift in how he saw her, and she was not just an administrator or a law enforcement officer, and she was someone who led from the front and took the same risks she asked her people to take, and that was something Jake understood and respected, and he realized with surprise that Victoria Grant reminded him of the best commanding officers he had served under, and the ones who earned loyalty, not through rank, but through example. And he thought maybe if things had been different, and if he had not screwed up so badly at the spaceport, they might have been friends or at least colleagues who respected each other. And maybe there was still a chance for that if he proved himself on this mission. The Vega Drift appeared on their sensors as a massive cluster of asteroids and debris that stretched for thousands of kilometers in every direction, and the rocks ranged from pebbles to city-sized chunks of stone and ice, and they tumbled and spun in chaotic patterns that made navigation almost impossible without visual confirmation, and the whole area was full of electromagnetic interference that made sensors unreliable and communications spotty. And it was exactly the kind of place where criminals would hide because no one in their right mind would come looking here, and the few survey ships that had tried to map the drift had either given up or disappeared and never been heard from again. Entering the drift, Jake announced over the ship intercom, "And everyone hold on, and this is going to get rough." and he gripped the controls and guided the dancing bear toward the outer edge of the asteroid field, and the ship shuddered as they hit. The first waves of debris and small rocks pinged off the hull like rain, and Jake's hands moved across the controls, making constant tiny adjustments and corrections as he threaded the ship through gaps that looked impossibly small, and past asteroids that could crush them if they got too close, and his entire focus narrowed to the space in front of them, and the feel of the ship responding to his commands, and everything else faded away. Chief Grant watched his hands move, and she said quietly, "You really are good at this," and Jake felt a small flash of pride despite everything, and he said, "Flying is the one thing I never mess up." And then he winced at his own words because, obviously, he had messed up plenty of things lately, and Chief Grant seemed to understand what he was thinking. And she said, "We all mess up, Commander. And the question is what we do after, and whether we learn from it, and whether we use our mistakes to become better people or just keep making the same errors over and over and expecting different results." And Jake thought about that and realized she was right, and this mission was his chance to show he had learned something and could be better than his worst moment. From the cargo bay, Karen's voice came through the intercom and said, "Commander, I am picking up energy signatures ahead and multiple ships and one big one and really big." And Jake felt his pulse quicken and said, "Can you identify them?" And Karen said, "Negative and too much interference but the power readings match what we would expect from a Krell stealth frigate and several smaller support vessels, and looks like they are clustered around a large asteroid and maybe using it for cover or as a base." And Chief Grant leaned forward and asked Morrison, "Can you get us close without being detected?" And Jake studied the sensor readings and the asteroid positions and calculated vectors and approach angles in his head and said, "I can get us to visual range, and after that it depends on how good their lookouts are, and whether anyone notices one more cargo hauler in all this debris." Jake brought the dancing bear around a massive asteroid the size of a small moon, and used its bulk to hide their approach, and the ship's old engines rumbled and complained, but held steady, and through the view screen they could finally see what they had come looking for, and Jake felt his breath catch in his throat because the Krell stealth frigate was even more impressive and terrifying than he remembered, and it hung in space like a predator waiting to strike, and its hull was dark and angular and covered in strange alien markings, and even powered down and motionless it looked dangerous and deadly, and ready to tear apart anything that got too close. Around the frigate were at least a dozen smaller ships, and some of them were military vessels that had been reported stolen months ago, and others were clearly pirate craft, with weapons welded onto civilian hulls and mismatched armor plates, and the whole fleet was clustered around a hollowed-out asteroid that served as their base, and Jake could see figures in spacesuits moving between the ships and cargo containers, and equipment being transferred, and it was a full-scale operation and much bigger than intelligence had suggested. And this was not just some small-time smuggling ring, and these were professionals with resources and organization, and probably connections to people in positions of power. "That is a lot more firepower than we expected," Detective Stone said from the cargo bay, and his voice was grim and worried, and Chief Grant was silent for a moment, studying the tactical display. And then she said, "We proceed, and Morrison position us near that debris field, and Stone prep the shuttle, and Karen, I need you to hack into their communication network, and I want to know what they are planning, and when they plan to move that frigate." And Jake guided the dancing bear to a position behind a cluster of broken asteroids where they could observe without being obvious, and the smugglers seemed too busy with their preparations to notice one more ship in the area. Karen's fingers flew across her console and screens lit up with code and data streams, and she muttered to herself as she worked. And Jake had no idea what she was doing, but it looked complicated and impressive, and after about 10 minutes she said, "I am in, and their security is good but not good enough, and I have access to their communications, and oh no, and Commander, you need to hear this." And she put the audio feed through the ship's speakers, and a rough male voice filled the bridge saying, "Final systems check complete, and the frigate is ready to fly, and we hit the colony transport lanes at 0600 tomorrow, and with this ship's stealth capabilities, we can take down a dozen transports before fleet even knows we are there." Jake felt his blood turn to ice because a dozen transports meant thousands of people, and families and children and colonists, just trying to build a life on the frontier, and they would have no warning and no chance, and that Krell frigate would cut through their shields like they did not exist. And he thought about all the transport ships he had escorted over the years, and the people he had met, and the faces he remembered, and some of them had become friends, and he could not let this happen and could not let these criminals murder innocent people for profit and whatever else they hoped to gain. And he looked at Chief Grant and saw his own horror reflected in her face. "We cannot let that ship leave this asteroid field," Chief Grant said, and her voice was hard and determined, and Detective Stone pointed out the obvious problem and said, "Chief, with respect, we are one cargo hauler against a frigate and a dozen support ships, and we need to call for backup." And Chief Grant shook her head and said, "Backup is 6 hours away and they could launch in 4, and we have to act now." And she turned to Jake and said, "Commander, I need options, and I need them fast because we are running out of time and those transport ships are not going to save themselves." Jake stared at the Krell frigate and his mind raced through possibilities and tactical scenarios and attack patterns and everything he knew about smugglers and criminals and how they thought. And the one advantage they had was surprise, because the smugglers did not know they were here and did not know anyone was watching, and they were confident and overconfident probably, and that meant they would not be as careful as they should be. And Jake looked at the asteroid base and the ships clustered around it and the way the smugglers had organized their operation, and an idea started to form in his mind, and it was dangerous and probably crazy, but it might work if they could pull it off, Karen Jake said. "And can you override the frigate's navigation systems if I get you close enough to their network hub?" And Karen looked thoughtful and said, "Maybe, but I would need direct physical access. And these Krell systems are locked down tight, and I cannot do it remotely because the encryption is too good. And I would need to actually be inside the ship and plug directly into their systems, and that means boarding the frigate and getting past whatever security they have and finding the network hub and hoping they have not changed all the access codes." And Stone said, "That sounds impossible." And Karen shrugged and said, "Difficult, not impossible, and there is a difference." "Then here is the plan," Jake said, and his voice was steady and confident, because this was what he was good at, and this was the kind of impossible mission he had flown dozens of times before. "And I fly us in close and make it look like we are just another cargo ship looking for salvage or trying to do business, and smugglers always need supplies and transport, and they will not turn away potential customers. And once we are docked, Stone and Karen board the frigate and make for the network hub, and Chief Grant and I provide a distraction, and we make enough noise that everyone comes running to deal with us. And while they are focused on us, Karen gets into the system and locks down the frigate and transmits its location to fleet, and game over." "What kind of distraction?" Chief Grant asked, and her eyes were sharp and calculating. And Jake allowed himself a grim smile and said, "The kind where we walk into their base and announce we are police and they are all under arrest, and then we start a fight and make enough chaos that they forget about everything else, and it will buy Karen and Stone the time they need to complete their mission. And yes, it is dangerous, and yes, we will probably get hurt, but it is better than letting them fly that frigate out of here and murder thousands of innocent people tomorrow morning." And Chief Grant looked at him for a long moment, and then she nodded and said, "All right, Commander, and let us do this. But if we die, I am blaming you." And Jake laughed, despite the situation, and said, "Fair enough, Chief." Detective Stone checked his weapon and his armor and said, "This is the craziest plan I have ever heard. And I have heard a lot of crazy plans in my career, and we are all probably going to die." And Chief Grant said, "Probably. But we are going to save a lot of lives first, and that is what matters." And Karen was already preparing her equipment and gathering the tools she would need to hack into the Krell systems, and she seemed excited rather than scared. And Jake realized she was the kind of person who lived for this sort of challenge, and the bigger the obstacle, the more interested she became, and he thought that was probably why Chief Grant had recruited her in the first place. Jake took a deep breath and put his hands on the controls and said, "Everyone ready?" And 3 voices answered yes. And he thought about everything that had happened over the past few days, and how he had gone from decorated commander to criminal, to someone trying to redeem himself and earn back the trust he had lost. And this mission was his chance to prove Chief Grant had been right to give him a second chance, and to show that he was more than just his anger and his mistakes, and whatever happened in the next hour would define the rest of his life, and he was determined to make it count and to do something that mattered, and to save those people on the transport ships who had no idea how close they had come to death. The dancing bear moved slowly through the smuggler fleet, and Jake kept his hands steady on the controls and tried to project an air of casual confidence, like they belonged here, and like they were just another crew trying to make money in the gray areas between legal and illegal commerce. And the smuggler ships loomed around them, and some of them had weapons tracking the dancing bear. but no one fired and no one challenged them, and Jake took that as a good sign and meant they were convincing, enough to pass initial inspection. And the smugglers were too focused on their preparations to worry about one more cargo hauler. Jake brought the ship alongside the Krell frigate and activated the docking clamps and felt them lock into place with a metallic clang that echoed through the hull. And now they were committed, and there was no backing out. And he looked at Chief Grant, and she was checking her weapon and her armor, and her face showed no fear or hesitation, and just determination and focus. And Jake realized she had probably done this sort of thing dozens of times, and walked into danger with the same calm professionalism she brought to everything else, and he felt grateful to have her beside him, and thought that if he had to go into a fight with someone watching his back, there were worse choices than Victoria Grant. Stone and Karen moved to the airlock, and Stone checked his equipment one last time and said, "Stay safe, Chief, and try not to get killed, and I would really prefer not to have to explain to the governor why we lost our chief of police on an unauthorized operation in an uncharted asteroid field." And Chief Grant smiled and said, "I will do my best, Detective, and you focus on getting Karen to that network hub and keeping her safe." And Stone nodded and said, "Yes, Chief." And then he and Karen cycled through the airlock and disappeared into the Krell frigate, and Jake watched them go on the security feed and thought about how much depended on two people he barely knew, and how fragile their whole plan was, and how many things could go wrong. Chief Grant stood and said, "All right, Commander, and time for us to provide that distraction and let us go make some noise." And Jake followed her to the airlock, and they cycled through and stepped onto the Krell frigate, and the interior was dark and cold and smelled wrong and alien, and the corridors were too narrow and the ceiling too low, and everything was designed for the Krell, who were shorter and wider than humans. And the whole ship felt hostile and unwelcoming, like it resented their presence, and Jake had been on Krell ships before, and it never got easier. And something about being inside a vessel designed by the enemy made his skin crawl, and his instincts scream that he should leave immediately. They moved through the corridors and followed the sounds of voices and equipment, and came to a large cargo bay where most of the smugglers had gathered, and there were maybe 30 people there, and all of them armed, and all of them dangerous looking, and they were loading supplies and checking weapons and talking about tomorrow's raid on the transport ships and how rich they were going to be, and how easy it would be to take down civilian ships that had no real defenses. And Jake felt his anger building again, but this time it was cold and controlled and focused, and this was not rage, and this was righteous fury at people who would murder innocents for profit. Chief Grant looked at Jake and nodded, and they walked right into the middle of the cargo bay, and everyone stopped and stared, and Chief Grant's voice rang out clear and strong, and she said, "Station police, and you are all under arrest for smuggling and possession of stolen military equipment and conspiracy to commit mass murder, and put down your weapons and surrender peacefully." And for a moment there was absolute silence, and then someone laughed, and then everyone was laughing, and one of the smugglers said, "Lady, you must be crazy, and you and your friend against all of us, and we have guns and you have nothing." And Chief Grant smiled and said, "We have the law and right on our side, and that counts for something. And also we have this," and she pulled her weapon and shot the ceiling, and the laughter stopped. Then everything exploded into chaos, and the smugglers rushed forward, and Jake moved to meet them, and years of combat training took over, and his body remembered what to do, even when his mind could barely keep up, and he blocked a punch and delivered one of his own, and felt something crunch under his knuckles, and someone grabbed him from behind, and he threw them over his hip, and they crashed into a stack of crates, and Chief Grant was beside him, and she moved with lethal efficiency, and every strike was precise and purposeful, and she dropped opponents faster than Jake could count, and they fought back to back and protected each other, and bought the time that Stone and Karen needed to reach the network hub and complete their mission. Jake took a hard punch to the jaw, and his head snapped back, and he tasted blood and kept fighting, because stopping meant dying, and dying meant those transport ships would be attacked tomorrow, and thousands of people would die, and he could not let that happen, and would not let that happen. And someone hit him in the ribs, and he felt something crack, and pain exploded through his chest, but he ignored it and grabbed his attacker and threw him into two other smugglers, and they all went down in a tangle of limbs, and Chief Grant kicked someone in the knee, and they dropped screaming, and she said, "Commander, we need to hold them just a little longer." And Jake said, "Understood, Chief," and blocked another attack and countered with an elbow that connected solidly. The smugglers kept coming, and there were too many of them, and Jake and Chief Grant were getting tired and taking damage, and Jake knew they could not keep this up much longer. And his arms felt like lead, and his legs were shaking, and his vision was starting to blur from exhaustion and blood loss, and he thought about his squadron, and the people he had served with, and the ones who had not come home, and he thought about the transport ships full of families and children, and he found strength he did not know he had, and kept fighting and kept moving and refused to go down because humanity did not surrender. And humanity did not quit, and humanity won because they were too stubborn to lose. Then Karen's voice crackled over their comm units and said, "I am in and locking down the frigate now and transmitting coordinates to fleet and ETA 12 minutes. And Jake felt a surge of relief so powerful it almost made him dizzy. And he looked at Chief Grant, and she was bleeding from a cut above her eye, and her armor was cracked, and she was smiling, and she said, "We did it, Commander. And now we just have to survive until fleet arrives." And Jake laughed and said, "Is that all?" and dodged another attack and grabbed a piece of pipe from the debris and used it to block a knife and disarm his opponent. The smugglers realized too late what was happening, and they tried to flee to their ships, but Karen had locked down every vessel in the area, and the docking clamps would not release, and the engines would not start, and they were trapped. And some of them kept fighting, and some threw down their weapons, and some tried to hide. But Jake and Chief Grant held their ground and kept them contained. And Stone appeared with Karen and joined the fight, and together the four of them controlled the cargo bay and waited for fleet to arrive, and it was the longest 12 minutes of Jake's life. But finally, he heard the sound of fleet ships arriving and breaching the smuggler vessels, and Marines flooding through the corridors and taking everyone into custody, and it was over and they had won. Jake sat down hard on a crate, and every part of his body hurt, and he was pretty sure he had at least 2 broken ribs, and his jaw was swelling and his knuckles were bleeding. But he was alive, and Chief Grant was alive, and Stone and Karen were alive, and most importantly, the Krell frigate was secure and would never be used to attack those transport ships, and thousands of people would wake up tomorrow morning and never know how close they came to death. And that was fine, because Jake did not do this for glory or recognition, and he did this because it was right and because someone had to, and because Chief Grant had given him a chance to be better than his worst moment, and he had taken that chance and made it count. The medical team arrived and started treating injuries, and Jake refused to go to the med bay until everyone else had been checked first, and the medic said, "Commander, you need treatment, and those ribs could puncture a lung," and Jake said, "I am fine, and treat the others first," and Chief Grant walked over and said, "Morrison, get to the med bay." And that is an order, and Jake looked at her and saw she was limping and had blood on her face and said, "You should go too, Chief," and she said, "We will both go and stop being stubborn," and Jake nodded and said, "Yes, Chief," and let the medic lead him away, and realized he was starting to understand how her people felt about her and why they followed her orders without question. And it was not fear or obligation, and it was respect earned through action and leadership by example. The med bay on the fleet ship was clean and bright and smelled like antiseptic, and Jake sat on an exam table while a doctor wrapped his ribs and treated his other injuries, and told him he was lucky nothing worse had happened. And Jake said, "I do not feel lucky." And the doctor smiled and said, "You are alive, and that is luckier than most people who get into fights on smuggler bases." And Jake had to admit that was true, and he thought about how close they had come to failure, and how many things could have gone wrong and how they had succeeded anyway. And he felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction and relief that the mission was over. Chief Grant was in the next exam room, and Jake could hear her arguing with another doctor about whether she needed stitches, and the doctor was insisting she did, and Chief Grant was saying she did not have time, and the doctor said, "Make time, Chief, and your people need you alive and functional and not bleeding all over the place." And eventually Chief Grant gave in, and Jake smiled, because it was good to know even legendary chiefs of police could not win arguments with doctors, and some things were universal regardless of rank or reputation or how many criminals you had arrested. Admiral Harris came to see them, and his face was a mixture of anger and grudging respect, and he said, "Commander Morrison, you have put me in a very difficult position, and on one hand you assaulted the chief of police and created a public relations nightmare, and on the other hand you just stopped a major attack on civilian targets and recovered a Krell stealth frigate and arrested 30 smugglers with connections to organized crime, and I do not know whether to court-martial you or give you another medal." And Jake said, "Whatever you think is appropriate, Admiral, and I accept responsibility for my actions." And Harris studied him for a long moment and then nodded and said, "We will talk more later, and for now, get some rest and heal up." Hours later, after most of the debriefs and reports and statements were done, Jake found himself alone with Chief Grant on the observation deck of the fleet ship, and they stood side by side looking out at the stars and the Vega drift in the distance, and the dancing bear being towed back to the station, and neither of them spoke for a while and just let the silence stretch between them. And Jake thought about everything that had happened, and how much had changed in just a few days, and how he had gone from hitting this woman to fighting beside her and trusting her with his life. And somewhere along the way she had stopped being the chief of police he had assaulted and become Victoria Grant, a person he respected and maybe even considered a friend. "You did good work today, Commander," Chief Grant said quietly. And Jake shook his head and said, "We did good work, Chief, and I could not have done it without you and Stone and Karen, and you all trusted me even though I gave you every reason not to. And you believed I could be better than that moment in the spaceport, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to prove you were right." And Chief Grant looked at him and said, "You already have, Commander, and today you showed me exactly who you are and not the angry, exhausted man who lost control for 5 seconds. And you showed me someone who cares about protecting others, and someone who will risk everything to save people he has never met. And that is the person I believed was hiding under all that stress and anger." Jake felt emotion tighten his throat and he said, "I am sorry, Chief, and I know I have said it before, but I need you to know I mean it. And what I did was wrong and there is no excuse, and I will carry the shame of it forever but I am grateful. You gave me a chance to make things right and to do something that mattered." And Chief Grant was quiet for a moment, and then she extended her hand and said, "I accept your apology, Commander, and not because I have forgotten what happened, and I will never forget, but because I believe people deserve second chances, and I believe you have learned from your mistake, and I believe you will be better going forward, and just do not make me regret this." Jake shook her hand and felt the firm grip of someone who had become an ally and maybe a friend, and he said, "I will not, Chief, and you have my word, and I will prove every day that your faith in me was justified." And Chief Grant smiled slightly and said, "I know you will, Commander. And besides, I might need your help again someday, and we make a good team, and next time, maybe we can start the mission without you hitting me first." And Jake laughed despite himself and said, "That sounds like a good plan, Chief, and I promise no more hitting anyone unless they are smugglers or criminals or people who actually deserve it." They stood together and watched the stars, and Jake thought about the transport ships that would fly safely tomorrow, and the families who would never know how close they came to death, and the children who would grow up and live their lives because 4 people had been willing to risk everything, and he thought about humanity and what made them special, and it was not their technology or their weapons or their ships, and it was their willingness to stand up and fight for what was right, and to protect the innocent, and to give second chances, and to believe in redemption. And Jake had learned that lesson the hard way, but he had learned it, and that made all the difference. Detective Stone and Karen Webb found them on the observation deck, and Stone said, "Chief, we just got word from the governor and he wants to see you, and also he is not happy about the unauthorized operation, and the risk you took, and the fact that you did not clear it with him first." And Chief Grant sighed and said, "Of course he is not happy, and politics never change, but he will get over it when he sees the positive press coverage and the fact that we saved thousands of lives." And Stone grinned and said, "That is what I told him, Chief, and he said you were probably right and that you usually are." And Chief Grant said, "Probably," and Stone, "And what about definitely?" Karen said, "Commander Morrison, I wanted to thank you, and your flying got us in, and your distraction gave me time to hack the systems, and without you, we never would have succeeded." And Jake said, "You are the one who actually stopped the frigate, Karen. And all I did was get punched a lot." And Karen laughed and said, "Getting punched is an important part of any good plan. And besides, you got punched very well and professionally." And Jake shook his head and said, "I am not sure that is a compliment, but I will take it." And everyone laughed, and for a moment Jake felt something he had not felt in weeks, and he felt like part of a team and like he belonged somewhere and like people trusted him and respected him, and it felt good. The news about the mission spread through the fleet and the colonies, and the story changed in the telling, and some versions focused on the recovered frigate, and some on the arrested smugglers, and some on the prevented attack, but all of them mentioned Commander Jake Morrison and Chief of Police Victoria Grant, and how they had worked together to stop a terrible crime. And Jake waited for someone to bring up the assault charge, and the video of him hitting Chief Grant in the spaceport. But Chief Grant had kept her word and recommended the plea agreement, and the prosecutor had accepted, and Jake would face probation and community service and anger management counseling and a formal reprimand, and his career would never reach the heights it might have, but he would still have a career and still be able to serve and still be able to make a difference, and that was more than he deserved and more than he had any right to expect. 6 months later, Jake Morrison stood in the courtroom and listened to the judge read the terms of his plea agreement and probation and community service and counseling and the formal reprimand that would stay on his record forever. And he accepted, it all without complaint or argument. And when the judge asked if he understood the terms, Jake said, "Yes, Your Honor. And I accept full responsibility for my actions, and I am grateful for the opportunity to make amends." And the judge looked at him with something that might have been respect and said, "Commander Morrison, I hope you take this seriously and use it to become better." And Jake said, "I will, Your Honor, and I already have." And the judge nodded and said, "Court is adjourned." Outside the courtroom, Chief Victoria Grant was waiting, and she smiled when she saw him and said, "How do you feel, Commander?" And Jake thought about it and said, "Lighter and like I can finally move forward." And Chief Grant nodded and said, "Good, and that is exactly how you should feel. And you paid your debt, and now you can focus on the future and on being the person you want to be." And Jake said, "Thank you, Chief. And for everything, and for believing in me when no one else did, and for giving me a chance I did not deserve." And Chief Grant said, "You earned that chance, Commander, and every step of the way. And I just gave you the opportunity and you did the rest." The media was there and cameras and reporters, and they all wanted statements and wanted to know about the assault and the mission, and how Jake and Chief Grant had gone from that terrible moment in the spaceport to working together and saving thousands of lives. And Jake let Chief Grant handle most of the questions because she was better at that sort of thing, and more diplomatic, and knew how to say what needed to be said without revealing anything that should stay classified. And when they asked Jake directly what he had learned, he said, "I learned that being a hero is not about never making mistakes, and it is about owning those mistakes and doing whatever it takes to make things right. And I learned that redemption is possible if you are willing to work for it, and I learned that some people are good enough to give you a second chance even when you do not deserve it." Admiral Harris called Jake into his office the next day and said, "Commander, I have a new assignment for you, and we need someone to train pilots in advanced combat tactics, and someone who knows the Krell better than anyone, and someone who has proven they can stay calm under pressure and make good decisions when lives are on the line. And I think you are that person. And if you are interested, the job is yours." And Jake felt surprised and grateful and said, "Yes, Admiral, and I am very interested." And Harris nodded and said, "Good, and you start next week." And Morrison, one more thing. And the incident at the spaceport will always be part of your record. But it does not have to define you, and you get to choose who you are going forward, and I think you have already chosen well. Jake threw himself into his new role and discovered he loved teaching and helping young pilots learn from his experience and his mistakes, and he was honest with them about what had happened and about how he had lost control and faced consequences, and learned to be better. And some of the pilots thanked him for that honesty and said it made them respect him more and not less. And because everyone makes mistakes, but not everyone admits them and learns from them. And Jake realized that his failure and his redemption had made him a better teacher and a better person, and had given him perspective he never would have gained otherwise. Chief Grant called him sometimes and asked for advice on cases that involved military matters or fleet personnel. And sometimes she just called to talk and check in and see how he was doing. And Jake looked forward to those calls and valued her friendship and her perspective. And one day she said, "Commander, I have been thinking about putting together a joint task force and combining police investigators with fleet personnel for operations that cross jurisdictions, and would you be interested in being the fleet liaison?" And Jake said, "Yes, absolutely, and when do we start?" And Chief Grant laughed and said, "I knew you would say that, and we start next month, and I will send you the details." The anger management counseling turned out to be more helpful than Jake expected, and his counselor was a woman named Patricia, who had worked with combat veterans for 20 years, and she understood the stress and the trauma and the way it built up until something small could trigger a massive reaction, and she taught Jake techniques for recognizing when he was getting overwhelmed, and ways to manage his emotions before they controlled him, and how to ask for help when he needed it. And Jake wished he had learned these things years ago, but he was learning them now, and that was what mattered, and he was determined to use them, and to never let himself lose control like that again. 1 year after the incident in the spaceport, Jake was walking through that same terminal and he saw the spot where he had hit Chief Grant and where his life had changed forever. And he stopped and stood there and thought about that moment and how everything could have been different, and if Chief Grant had not been the person she was, and if she had not believed in redemption and second chances, he would be in prison now and his career would be over and his life would be destroyed, and instead he was here and teaching and serving and making a difference, and he had friends and purpose and hope for the future. And all because one remarkable woman had chosen mercy over revenge and rehabilitation over punishment. Jake felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see Chief Grant standing beside him. And she said, "I saw you standing here and thought you might need company." And Jake smiled and said, "I was just thinking about how much has changed and how grateful I am." And Chief Grant said, "You changed it, Commander. And I just gave you the opportunity and you did the hard work and made yourself better." And Jake said, "We both know that is not entirely true, Chief. And you could have destroyed me. And instead, you saved me, and I will never forget that." And Chief Grant said, "And I will never forget that you proved me right, and that you became exactly the person I believed you could be. And that is the real victory here." They walked through the terminal together and talked about the joint task force and upcoming operations and new threats on the frontier, and just normal everyday things, and people recognized them, and some smiled and some nodded respectfully, and no one looked at them with disgust or anger. And the story had become something different now, and not the tale of a commander who assaulted a police chief, but the story of redemption and second chances, and how humans were capable of change and growth and forgiveness, and Jake thought that was a better story, and a more important one, and the kind of story that gave people hope and showed them that mistakes did not have to be permanent, and that you could fall and get back up and keep going. As they walked, Jake thought about humanity and what made them special among all the species in the galaxy, and it was not their technology or their weapons or their ships, and those things were impressive, but other species had them too, and what made humanity unique was their capacity for change and their ability to look at their worst selves and choose to be better, and their willingness to give second chances and believe in redemption, and their refusal to let one mistake define a person forever. And that was the real strength of humanity and the thing that would carry them to the stars and beyond. And it was not perfection, and it was the willingness to be imperfect and learn and grow and become better. Commander Jake Morrison had learned that lesson the hard way, and through shame and consequences and the grace of someone who believed he could be better. And he had taken that lesson and used it to become a better pilot and a better teacher and a better person, and he knew he would carry the scar of what he had done forever. But scars were proof you had survived, and proof you had healed, and proof that damage was not permanent. And he wore his scar with humility and determination, and the knowledge that he had been given a gift and the gift of a second chance, and he would honor that gift every single day for the rest of his life, by being worthy of it and by helping others and by standing up for what was right. And that was what made humanity powerful, and not their refusal to make mistakes, but their willingness to learn from them, and their capacity to forgive and be forgiven, and their belief that people could change and grow and become better than they were, and that no one was beyond redemption if they were willing to do the work and face the consequences and earn back the trust they had lost. And Commander Jake Morrison and Chief Victoria Grant were living proof of that truth, and their story would be told across the colonies and inspire others who had made mistakes and needed to know that second chances were possible, and that redemption was real, and that humanity's greatest strength was not in being perfect, but in being perfectly human, and that was enough and more than enough, and it was everything.